So, hosting Ruth Reichl at an American art museum may be kind of a surprise to you. But at Crystal Bridges, we believe that art and in food enhance one's life and also fuels creativity. In fact, culinary is in many ways the heart of this museum. As you can see behind me, 11 hopefully is bustling right now. Well, somewhat. But also because of the public programs that culinary hosts. So you all have been to a WOW, I'm sure. You've been to Create. You've been to our new series that's called Dish, that's all about women in art and food. Yeah, that's right. Give it up for the ladies. So, Ruth Reichl served as Editor-in-Chief of Gourmet Magazine from 1999 to 2009. Before that, she was the restaurant critic of both the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times. And prior to that, as co-owner of the Swallow Restaurant from 1974 to 1977, she played a pivotal role in the revolution that took place in Berkeley, California. It's important stuff. Ms. Reichl began writing about food in 1972 and has authored the critically acclaimed best-selling food memoirs, Tender at the Bone, Comfort Me with Apples, Garlic and Sapphires, and For You, Mom, Finally. And in 2014, she published her first novel, Delicious. Ms. Reichl hosted Eating Out Loud, 3 specials on the Food Network covering New York, San Francisco, and Miami. She is the executive producer of Gourmet's Diary of a Foodie, public television's 30-episode series, which debuted in 2006, an executive producer and host of Gourmet's Adventures with Ruth, a 10-episode public television series in 2009. But perhaps we recognize her the most because she was a judge on Top Chef Masters. I can tell you, as a restaurateur and a budding food writer myself, having dinner with Ruth in 11 just a few short minutes ago, I've never been more mortified. It was the quietest I've been in 17 years. I was just watching her intently. But when she picked up her phone and took a picture of the soup, I knew we were cool in the gang, so I was happy. Ruth has been honored with 6, count them, 6 James Beards Awards. Yeah, -2 for me. She also received the 2008 Matrix Award for magazines from New York Women in Communications. Also, interesting enough, she holds a BA and an MA in art history from the University of Michigan. Yeah. So as you can see, Ruth Reichl is an excellent choice for the Distinguished Speaker Series here at our beloved museum. Please join me in welcoming Ruth Reichl.
Wow. I can't tell you how happy I am to be here. I have been dying to come to this museum. So it's really a treat for me, and getting to spend a day in Bentonville, you guys are really lucky to live here. It is, it's beautiful, it's friendly. I actually had lunch at a little food cart today and tweeted that I think it's the pleasantest service I've ever had anywhere. But I thought that I would tell you a little bit about my journey to this cookbook. And the truth is that my story is really the story of being lucky enough to be able to follow your passion and just keep following it. You know, when I grew up, I did not know that it was possible to be a food writer. I mean, it never crossed my mind. And to be honest, to the end of their lives, my parents kept saying, when are you going to stop doing this nonsense and do something serious with your life? So I did not grow up in a household where food was treated with reverence. In fact, in the household I grew up in, writing was the highest calling. My father was a book designer, and they really considered, what great people did was write. But I never thought that I could write. And so I went to school to study the thing that I sort of enjoyed, which was art history. And when I got out of graduate school, we moved to New York, and I really did think that I would walk into the Museum of Modern Art and they would say, oh yes, we've been looking for a new curator of contemporary sculpture. And in fact, what they said was, how fast can you type? And I got one job after another that I truly hated. But meanwhile, I'm living on the Lower East Side of New York, which was still a very vibrant food community. And I was wandering around talking to, people in Chinese grocery stores and people in the old Jewish section. And I was living in Little Italy, and the mafia moms would sort of, if you stood long enough in front of a can of tomatoes, somebody would come up and say, you want my recipe for Sunday sauce? And I was going home and cooking huge meals for all my friends. And one day, one of my friends said, you're such a good cook, you ought to write a cookbook. Well, of course, today, if you went to a publisher and said, I'd like to write a cookbook, they would say, where'd you learn to cook? Can you cook? Where do the recipes come from? But in 1971, a publisher said, oh, interesting idea. A cookbook by a young person. Sure, we'll take it. And so I write this cookbook. Of course, nobody, my editor, should have had the sense to say to me, people are going to be embarrassed to go into a bookstore and say, do you have And so the book was not a huge hit. My husband and I ended up moving to Berkeley, where I opened this little restaurant with a group of people. And people always say, oh, she's a chef. Let me assure you, I am not a chef. This was we did this the way people get together and start a theater. Oh, let's open a little restaurant. And we were a bunch of overeducated people who loved to cook, and we started this restaurant. Meanwhile, I had loved writing the cookbook, and I thought, well, I'll write about what I know about, which is art. And I was writing little art pieces for a magazine, and one of my editors came into my restaurant every night. And one night, as I was giving him dinner, he looked at me, and it was as if a light bulb went off over his head, and he said, you're a much better writer than our restaurant critic. And you know food. Have you ever thought about being a restaurant critic? Now, I have to tell you, this was not the moment in my life where I thought, oh, my career as a food writer is starting. I didn't think of it as a career. What I thought was free meals. They're going to pay for us to go to restaurants? Which, my husband and I are living in a commune in Berkeley. We have no money. The idea of going out and eating free meals was really thrilling. Well, I have written about the first review I wrote in Tender at the Bone. But what I've never written about is the second review, because when I turned that review in, the editor said, well, this is really good, but before we fire our restaurant critic, you better write a second one. We better make sure that this isn't just a flash in the pan. So this time, he said, we want you to go to the most expensive restaurant in San Francisco, a French restaurant called Robert. So I go home to my commune and tell my friends that we're about to go to the most expensive restaurant in San Francisco. And of course, we don't have any clothes appropriate for this. So we all go to our favorite store, Value Village, and we get ourselves all dressed up, and we gather in our crumbling Victorian house and we look each other over and we think we look pretty swell. And we get into my husband's van to go to San Francisco. Now, Doug is an artist, and this was no ordinary van. He had converted his Chevy panel van into a moving camera obscura. He had painted the walls white, put mattresses on the floor, put a board behind the two front seat with a pinhole in it. So when you lay down in the back of the van, the landscape was projected upside down on the walls of the van. And we thought this was much cooler than Windows. So we get into the van and we lie down and we cross the Bay Bridge into San Francisco. And of course, we can't give this vehicle to a valet because it's not a car, it's a work of art. So we spend a lot of time looking for a place to park. And then we tumble out like clowns coming out of a circus vehicle, and we go into the restaurant. In my many years as a restaurant critic, I have learned that the worst thing that can possibly happen to you as a critic is to have your friends give you their opinions. And I learned later to say, this is my job, not your job. I'm working, you just enjoy your meal, don't tell me what you think. But I didn't know that. And my friends, of course, all desperately want me to get this job because they see all the free meals too. So they are throwing ideas at me. And, you know, my husband, the artist, is noticing the typography on the menus, the color of the napkins. One of my roommates, who was a wonderful cook, is sitting there going, yes, there's a little basil in here and some rosemary. Another one had been a bartender, and his eyes are trained on the bartender, and they're just throwing information at me. And I have one of these epiphanies, which if you're very lucky, you occasionally have as a writer. And I suddenly see us as a gang that has been sent by a rival restaurateur to find problems with this restaurant. And I go home and I go into my little studio, and in a blaze of inspiration, I write a little film noir script. And it begins, the names have all been changed to protect the innocent. And I write this all, the food is kind of woven in, but it's very different than anything that is a traditional restaurant review. And I think I better sleep on it. And I get up in the morning and I read it again, and I have the perfect title, Cops and Robert. And I'm pretty pleased with it. And I drive to San Francisco. Of course, you can't park in San Francisco. I throw it on my editor's desk, and I go back to Berkeley. And halfway across the Bay Bridge, the stupidity of what I have just done hits me. This is not a restaurant review. This is a dopey little short story. It's not even a very good short story. I've just lost this job. None of my friends are ever going to speak to me again. I go into a complete tailspin. And this is, of course, before cell phones, so I can't call my editor. But the minute I get off the bridge, I go to the first payphone. I throw in every penny I have. I call John and say, don't read that piece. It's not, I picked up the wrong piece. That wasn't the one I meant to give you. I'm on my way back with the real review. And how I thought I was going to write another review and get right back, I don't know, but I thought I was. And there's this long silence, and then John says, it's too late. I've already read it. And he lets me suffer, because he's a little bit of a sadist. And then he says, this is fantastic. I mean, remember, this is the mid-'70s. It's new journalism. And he says, this is just what we're looking for. American restaurants are growing and changing, and the writing about them should change too. So you have the job, and now I want you to stretch the form. So for the next 6 years at New West Magazine, I wrote what are surely the weirdest restaurant reviews ever written. I wrote things that science fiction set on Mars. I wrote love stories. I wrote westerns. I wrote things set in the 17th century. And they sort of got this little cult following. And the next thing I know, I'm getting a call from the Los Angeles Times saying, we want you to come be our restaurant critic. Now think about this. I have no formal training as a cook. I have no journalism background. I wasn't even an English major. But I'm now about to be the loudest voice on restaurants west of the Mississippi. And for my first review, they asked me to review, somebody had bought Perino's, which had been the restaurant of the Hollywood heyday. And someone had refurbished it, and they said, this would be a good restaurant for you to review. So I go there, and I imagine eating with Gloria Swanson. And I turn this piece in, and the editor of the newspaper comes and he says, Ruth, could you come into my office? And I go into his office, and he looks at me and he says, Ruth, this is a newspaper. And I said, I know it's a newspaper. He said, you can't make stuff up. You didn't go there with Gloria Swanson. She's dead. And I suddenly had this terrible moment of thinking, I'm going to have to write reviews in a completely different way than I've ever done it before. And I thought, like, I don't want to write consumer review reports. I don't want to just say to people, this is too salty, buy this, don't buy that. I have to do something else. And I went to the editor and I said, what is the circulation of the LA Times? Now, this is a long time ago. This is in the heyday of newspapers. And he said 1.5 million people. And I said, so of those 1.5 million people, how many of them do you think actually go to these very expensive restaurants that we review? And he said, maybe 1%. And I said, okay, I want to write reviews for the 99% who don't go there. I want to take people with me. I want to tell all the people who can't afford to go there what it's like to eat in these restaurants. And so for the next 10 years, I did that. And I think the greatest compliment I ever got, I got a call one day from a man who said, I wish you would review more steakhouses. And I said, why do you want me to do steakhouses? And he said, well, I had open heart surgery 10 years ago, and I'm not allowed to eat red meat anymore. But every time you write about, I can taste that meat, so could you please write about steak more often? Okay, so fast forward 10 years, and by now it is starting to occur to me that this really is my life, that it took me really almost until, I kept thinking my real life was going to start, and at some point I was going to stop writing about food and do the real thing I was meant to do. And then I got a call from the New York Times asking me to come be their critic. And it suddenly hit me, oh, I guess this is what I do now. And going to the New York Times was a whole new order of, on my first foray into New York, I met someone who said to me, I work in a restaurant and there's a huge picture of you pinned in the back with wanted written across the bottom. And the man I work for will pay $2,000 to anybody who spots you in a restaurant. And I kept thinking, this isn't right. I don't want them to roll out the red carpet for me. So I started wearing disguises in restaurants. And I turned myself into many people. My favorite was probably Chloe. Chloe was the proof to me that blondes do have more fun. Chloe was a very soignée blonde woman with a lot of makeup, and I bought a very expensive wig for her, and she always had her nails, bright red nails done, and I would sometimes go and sit, and when I was going to a very fancy restaurant, I would sometimes sit in the bar and wait for a man to come up and ask if I would join him for dinner. And I want to tell you, there is no better disguise than having dinner with someone who doesn't know that you are not the person you're pretending to be. My husband, I should mention, was not real thrilled about this. But I've written in Garlic and Sapphires about a lot of the disguises that I wore, but I've never written about Stella. And I think I never wrote about Stella because I was a little embarrassed by her. Stella was also a blonde, but she was a very different blonde. To be Stella, I got a platinum wig, and I bought clothes that enhance your body. So she was very buxom, and she wore very tight clothes. And I took Stella to a very staid Upper East Side restaurant, one of those places where they bring out, they have a menu, but the waiter comes to the table and says, and today we also have, and there are baskets of black truffles and white truffles and beautiful asparagus. And on one visit, he brought out a beautiful striped bass. And Stella said, "So, is that striped bass wild or farmed?" And the waiter looked at her and said, I will ask the chef, madam. And he came back, and I know that he really said this because I printed it in the New York Times. And I would not have done it if I had not had witnesses to it. He came back and he said, the chef says it's wild. It comes from about where you come from, Coney Island. Coney Island. And I printed it because my deepest belief about restaurants is that when we go to really good restaurants, we have a contract with the restaurant. And we agree that we will give them a lot of money. They, in turn, agree not only that they will give us wonderful food, but also that they will give us the illusion, if only for a few hours, that we are privileged people. And it doesn't matter if you're the President of the United States or Stella Rose, you deserve that respect. And I was furious about how this woman had been treated. And I thought they should be called out for it. Well, one of the things that happened at the New York Times is that I started getting phone calls from editors who said, you must be writing a book, and if you're writing a book, I'd like to see the manuscript. Well, I wasn't writing a book. But after about the 15th phone call, I went home and said to my husband, I must be writing a book. What do you think I ought to write about? And he said, well, you're always telling these stories about the wonderful people who taught you to cook. Why don't you write their stories? And when I turned that book in, my editor said to me, all of these stories are wonderful, but you need to make the whole book work as well as each of these stories works. And so it became a kind of unwitting memoir. I hadn't intended it to be a memoir, but I was the through line. It was the only way I could think of connecting these stories one to the other. And it was a very interesting time because when Tender at the Bone came out, it was a memoir with recipes, and bookstores did not know what to do with it. There was not at that point a genre known as the food memoir. Today, they come out almost every day. But at that point, they put it in with cookbooks, but it only had 12 recipes in it, so it wasn't really comfortable being in cookbooks. And I sort of had this feeling that this little book needed a little push. And so I ended up reading the audiobook. Reading an audiobook is an amazing experience for a writer because you are sitting in a booth with 3 people trained on your every word. And they have very, very powerful microphones. These microphones pick up every stomach gurgle, every time you swallow. And they had just recorded Toni Morrison before me, and she apparently has a very noisy stomach. And they thought because I was a food person, they would need a lot of time for me as well. And in fact, I'm a food person. My stomach knows how to behave itself. So it went very quickly. And I read the end, and these 6 eyes looked up at me and said, "That's it? You're leaving us here? What happened next?" And they made me take them out and tell them the rest of the story. And so I went home and said to my editor, "Do you think I should write some more?" And she said yes. And I'd said, well, really, you will understand this if you've read Tender at the Bone, that I felt like I kind of owed my mother because I had made fun of her in the book. And I thought I would write her story. And so I put that off. And after I had written Comfort Me with Apples, I thought I was really going to write my mother's story. But my editor said, "Come on, Ruth, all anybody really wants to know is what's it like to be the restaurant critic of the New York Times. After all, you wore all those disguises. We want to know about that." And at this point, I had been lucky enough to move on to Gourmet Magazine. And when I was finished with Garlic and Sapphires, my editor said to me, "You're at the magazine, don't you want to write a novel? I mean, don't you want to really stretch your wings and write a novel?" And I said, "Well, I don't think I can write a novel. I mean, I'm not used to making things up." And she said, "Oh, come on. All your books read like novels anyway. And besides, what do you think you're doing when you wear those disguises? You're living fiction. Just put that on the page." So I think I probably would have started writing a novel at that point, but something intervened. And just as I was thinking about it, I was on book tour for the second gourmet cookbook, and I was in Seattle being interviewed by a reporter in a restaurant, and being very polite, I had turned off my phone. And we were in a restaurant, and I suddenly see the manager of the restaurant coming towards me. And he looked very worried, and he said, there's an emergency phone call for you. And I immediately thought something horrible had happened to my husband or my son. And so it was kind of a relief to hear my boss's voice. And then I thought, why is he calling me? And he said, "You have to come back to New York." And I said, "No, I'm on tour for the Gourmet Cookbook. I'll be in Portland tomorrow." And he said, "No, you have to come back to New York." And I sort of thought that I was going to get fired. But I never in a million years imagined that I would be standing there the next morning with my staff and learn that they were closing the magazine. Gourmet was 69 years old. We had the highest circulation in the magazine's history. We were in a recession and things were bad, but things were bad all over the industry. I mean, they weren't worse for us than for anybody else. And after we all sort of got over the shock of this, James, our drinks editor, went into his office, which was lined with bottles of wine. He had hundreds of them, which he had intended to taste. And he said, "We're not leaving them one drop." So we started drinking. And then it was 6 o'clock, and none of us was really ready to give each other up at that point. And I said, everybody come back to my house. And we went back and had an all-night wake. We drank all night. And the next morning, everybody on staff went back in to pack their offices up. But I had to go back on book tour because I was contractually obligated to continue the tour for the Gourmet Cookbook, which was so strange because it wasn't my book. I wasn't making a penny from it. They had just closed the magazine. And it was like an endless revival meeting. In city after city, people wanted to stand up, and usually with tears running down their faces, they would tell me how much the magazine had meant to them. They told stories of, catering their daughter's wedding out of the magazine, that 3 generations of them had been gourmet readers. And it was incredibly emotional. And really a sign of, what an enormous impact this magazine had had on so many people. Well, finally, the Gourmet Cookbook hit the bestseller list, and I could go home. And I went home, and there was a phone call from a secretary at Condé Nast saying, we really need you to clean out your office. Your office is the only one that's still not emptied at Gourmet. And I went into the magazine, and it was the saddest place I have ever been. I walked in the door, and where the big silver G, it's been spelled out, they pulled them out, and there were just holes in the wall. And other magazines had come down looting, and there were dead plants and broken chairs and big dumpsters in the middle of the hall with every photograph Gourmet had ever taken just crumpled up and thrown in with broken staplers. And it was so depressing that I thought, I have to go down to the kitchen. The kitchen will be, kitchen is my happy place. I'll go down to the kitchen. And I went into the kitchen, and it was not a happy place. They had locked the doors, but not removed the food. So for 6 weeks, and in fact, the last thing we had been getting ready was a Southern meal, and there were 25 pounds of crab meat that had been sitting there for 6. It was really sad. And I've turned this into a scene in my novel, Delicious. I've made it worse than it was, but it was pretty bad. And as I was walking out, there was an orange sitting on the counter. And it was beautiful, bright orange, and it was just so nice to see something that was bright. I picked it up, and it just disintegrated in my hand. So now I'm really depressed. And I know that there is one place that will not be changed at all, because the last thing I did before leaving Gourmet was lock the library. The library at Gourmet Magazine, for almost 70 years, every cookbook published in America had gone through there. And because we didn't have room for 100,000 cookbooks, it was beautifully curated. And the cooks we had at Gourmet, we had 8 test kitchens and 12 full-time cooks, and they used that. It was their major resource. So it was a wonderful library, and I thought, this should not get looted by other people. So I had locked it, and I went in there, and it was unchanged. I just sat there with the books breathing around me. And then I looked off way in the back of the library, and I saw a filing cabinet I had never noticed before. And I went and opened it up, and every letter Gourmet had ever gotten was filed away in there. And I thought, this has to be an amazing resource. I mean, this is the history of American food is in here. And it's really kind of tragic because if they're throwing away the photographs, they're not going to keep old letters. They're just going to get tossed. And I started going through them, and they were kind of a disappointment. They were mostly complaints, recipe requests. And I thought if I had time to spend 3 weeks going through these, I'm sure there's gold here. But I don't have time to do it, and it's really time for me to go pack up my office. So I went to my office, and I will never know why I did this, but I sat down at my desk, and instead of starting to pack, I wrote the letters I wished I had found. And I sat there all afternoon. I just conjured up a little girl named Lulu in Akron, Ohio during World War II, writing to James Beard, who in fact did work at Gourmet. And I wrote 4 years of letters from her, asking him for help and talking about her problems with rationing. And, it was just what I had hoped to find. And when I was done with that, I emailed them to myself and packed up and left. And the next morning I went home and I thought, oh, this is probably the beginning of that novel I was always going to write. And because I don't have a job anymore, I should write a novel. But that first morning, my husband, who's a television producer, was away on assignment. My son was in college. And I just couldn't get myself out of bed. I mean, I was just suddenly the enormity of the magazine closing. I had been on tour and it had kind of not really hit me. And suddenly, I'd been in this empty office, and it wasn't just that the magazine had closed and that we had been really a family, and that, but there were people who it was the only job they'd ever had. People who'd worked there. My secretary had been there for 35 years. And it closed on my watch, and the weight of, I should have saved their jobs, that, the guilty feeling of, just really hit me. And I thought, I can't wallow in this. I have to cook. And I invited a bunch of people over. I said, I'm going to make the biggest chocolate cake in the world. I made this chocolate cake, and for the next 6 or 7 months, I kept trying to write this novel, but really what I did was cook. And I went into the kitchen every day, and I started doing the kind of cooking that I hadn't been able to do in a long time. I'd done very result-oriented cooking. I'd rush home like every other working mother and get dinner on the table really quickly. And now I had time to talk to cheesemakers and butchers and bakers and go in and out of stores and just collect ingredients and cook for the pure pleasure of it. And it literally did save my life. I mean, I don't know what I would have done if I couldn't have cooked at that point. And in the spring of that year, we have constant gourmet reunions. We're having one on Monday, in fact. And we tend to meet in this very cheap and cheerful restaurant in Chinatown. And as one of my colleagues is running his hand across the oilcloth tablecloth, we're in this brightly lit place, and he said, boy, eating in these restaurants must really be hard on you. I mean, how long did you have an expense account for? And I did the math, and I said, I've had an expense account since 1978. And he said, so you're telling me that since 1978, you've been able to eat in any restaurant in the world on somebody else's dime? And I said, yeah. And he said, boy, you must really miss those restaurants. And I looked at him and I said, it hadn't even hit me that I wasn't eating in restaurants anymore. I have loved being in the kitchen again. I have just loved being able to cook. And he looked at me and he said, you know, Ruth, for as long as I've known you, you've said that you thought that your mission in life was to get people back in the kitchen. Don't you think you ought to write this book? And that really is the genesis of my journey to my kitchen year. And I very much hope that what this book will do, I mean, I feel that we in the press have a lot to answer for. I feel like we've made people think that cooking is a test, it's a performance, that if you can't cook at a chef level, you shouldn't cook at all. We've made it all about the result and not about the journey. And to me, cooking for your family is the most important thing that you can do. And I know that my son would tell you one of the main reasons that I left the New York Times to go to Gourmet was because Nick was 9 and it was time for us to start having family dinner. And I think he would tell you that the most important moment in his life was at that point where where I stopped going out every night and we started sitting down to dinner together every night. And I don't think it matters what you put on the table. It doesn't have to be a fabulous meal. It just has to be food that your family knows was cooked with love and that you sit down together and eat it. And my journey sort of comes back around to my own childhood where, if you've read Tender at the Bone, you know my mother was the world's worst cook. But we sat at that table every night, and I learned to write at the table because in the family that I grew up in, you came to dinner with a story about your day. You couldn't just sit there. You had to say something. And that's how I learned to write. I learned to write by telling stories at the table. And my deepest hope is that this book will get people back into the kitchen and back to the table. Thank you.
Wow. Ruth, thank you so much. I do want to open it up for questions because I think that there's some people in here that are great fans and they want to probably ask some questions. I'm going to start it by just asking, do Stella and Chloe ever rear their heads? Is it?
They don't,
They don't.
because when I left the New York Times, we did a charity auction for Share Our Strength, and we auctioned them all off.
Oh, no.
So their clothes are all gone.
Okay, who else has a question?
And, you know, as I have said, I believe privacy is overrated, so ask me anything you want.
Hi, Ruth. I came in from Dallas today. I missed you when you were there, but the Dallas Morning News critic has just revealed herself, and she's getting a lot of critique about because she's...
This is Leslie.
Yes, and now that she's known, there's a lot of criticism and about a lot of people who disagree, and now because when she goes in, she's recognized and so forth. So I'd be interested in your comment, because she's no longer anonymous when she's doing her critiques of the restaurants. And I loved your disguises. I loved your book and how much you said about how differently people were treated because of how you presented yourself. And I'd love to hear some comments on that.
Well, you know, I deeply believe that we don't go out just to eat. So if all you're going to review is the food itself, they really can't change the food that much. But we go out for many, many reasons. And the experience can change dramatically. And as you know, I mean, my most famous review was the first one where I did a double review of Le Cirque, where I was in disguise and where I was not in disguise. And they could not have been more different experiences. I mean, I was treated like dirt on 6 occasions when I was in disguise. And then I went in as myself, even though I didn't use my own name. He recognized me. And instantly, they were dancing around the table, white truffles, black truffles, and the owner, my favorite line ever. I had been made to wait hours before. Suddenly, I'm there an hour early for my reservation. He leads me forward, parts the waiting crowd, like the Red Sea parting, leads me forward and says, "The King of Spain is waiting in the bar, but your table is ready." And I said to my nephew, who I was there with, "Oh yeah, the King of Spain is waiting in the bar." And Johnny turned around and he said, "The King of Spain is waiting in the bar." And, I mean, I truly believe that if you're going to be a fair critic, you cannot let them roll out the red carpet for you. It is just a completely different experience. I mean, I know now, I don't go in disguise anymore. I'm not reviewing restaurants. And it's kind of wonderful. And, all my friends used to say when I was in disguise, "Oh, I hope they see through your disguise." So I truly believe that if you're going to be a really fair critic, you need to be anonymous.
Okay, great. I have a question over here.
All right, so I am fascinated by your mother, which I think that you are too, and she reminds me a lot of my mom. And so I was wondering, in not becoming my mother, when you said that your dad was kind of placating her and she bought this piece of art that he was sure would be a good investment for the family, was it a good investment? And what you can tell us about that piece of art, especially because we're in a museum, what was that piece of art that she had purchased?
It probably would have been a good investment. Oh, this is such a terrible story I'm about to tell you, but it was a Lumia, and so this is in the 60s. It was one of the first. It was like a box with when you turned it on, lights moved through it, and the art changed. It was actually quite wonderful. And we all came to love it. And my guess is that it would be very valuable today. But this is what happened when my mother passed away. My nephew was just coming to New York to go to graduate school at Columbia to get his MBA. And I was living in Los Angeles at the time, and he literally moved in like a few days after she passed away. And Johnny said, he moved in with his girlfriend, and Johnny said, "Can I get rid of Nana Mimi's stuff?" And I said, "Sure, you don't want her clothes there." And my brother came a week later, and he said, "Did you tell Johnny he could get rid of everything in the apartment?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, he got rid of everything. He called Goodwill and said, 'Take it all.'" So I have no idea where it is.
I was wondering if you were to have a last meal, what you would order at a restaurant, or if you were going to cook something at home, what would you have?
Well, it would be a very long meal, I'll tell you that. And, my answer would change any day of the week. I can tell you something today. Tomorrow, I would probably tell you something completely different. But right now, if I were going to do it, I would probably start with clams on the half shell because I love clams. And then I would have blini with caviar because I really love buckwheat blini with caviar. And then I would have a salad made with warm, just picked lettuces and a Jersey tomato in August when tomatoes are really great. And then I would have corn on the cob, Silver Queen corn that was like, 10 minutes out of the earth. And then I would have a really good, very well-aged porterhouse steak and a baked potato, which I think baked potatoes are deeply underrated, with really good butter on it. And fresh peas, really good asparagus. And then for dessert, I would have one perfect peach.
What differences did you find between California restaurants and New York restaurants?
Oh, great question. They are really, when I moved from LA to New York, which was 1993, New York restaurants have, they're really fortunate because there's so much tourism there. And the economics of restaurants in really high-end restaurants in New York are, they get the Japanese tourists at 6 o'clock, the Americans at 8 or 8:30, and the Spanish at 10:30 or 11. So they can turn those tables 3 times. There aren't a lot of places in the world where the economics work that way for restaurants. So LA just did not have that many good high-end restaurants. Right now, Los Angeles is, I think, one of the great eating cities of the world because of its the demographics of Los Angeles mean that you can be a Chinese person in LA and never need to learn to speak English. You can speak Mandarin your whole time. You can be Thai, you can be Salvadoran, and so they don't have to do restaurants for an American audience. So there's fabulous, authentic, ethnic food there. High-end restaurants, not so much. The other big difference is in terms of dessert. One of the great differences just between Northern California and Southern California is Southern California likes things much sweeter than Northern California, and New York likes them even sweeter.
Hi, Ruth. As a writer who just greatly admires your work, who were some of the writers that you really admire?
Well, probably my greatest role model has been MFK Fisher, who I was fortunate enough to become friends with. And she was actually the person who said to me, "You need to go work at a newspaper." He said, "You're polishing every word. Go work at a newspaper where it will be fish wrap tomorrow." I also, there are a string of great older food writers, Liebling, A.J. Liebling, Angelo Pellegrini, and then there are, among the non-food writers, Grace Paley has been a huge influence on me. I can sort of go on and on. I read a ton of fiction. It's kind of my passion. That's a good start.
So we're going to ask one more question after I ask you to recount one thing. So I love the stories about your mother. I think a lot of us do. But could you tell us a little bit about the special soup that she would sometimes make?
Yeah, okay. So my earliest memory is watching my mother go through the refrigerator, scraping the blue stuff off the top and saying, "Little mold never hurt anyone." She was truly, I mean, she did not believe that rot was bad for you. And you know, the first story in Tender at the Bone is of my mother inviting people to an engagement party for my brother and putting 26 of them in the hospital with food poisoning. So she was quite a character. But her most prized dish was something she called everything stew. And she would just, like every 2 weeks or so, she would go through the refrigerator, taking out everything that was in there and making a stew out of it. And she didn't care what it was. So, it could be half a turkey and some onions and a little applesauce. And I was watching her do this one day, and she's just blithely throwing in, "Oh, there goes some broccoli, and yeah, well, here's a little bit of that chili that you brought home, and we'll throw that in." And then I said, "Mom, you just put in half of an apple pie." And she said, "Oh, yeah, it'll be good." I will tell you one last mom story, because it is the best story. So my mother, and you have to imagine, when you're imagining this, my father, the most polite man on the face of the earth. My father literally, no matter what my mother served for dinner, every night he would take her hand, kiss it, and thank her for dinner. I mean, he was really polite. So one morning she woke him up and said, "Darling, come into the kitchen. I want you to taste something." And my father, who woke up very slowly, sort of gropes his way down the hall into the kitchen, and she put something in his mouth. And my father, being polite, valiantly tried to swallow this. And he said it was the most disgusting thing he had ever had in his, and he loved, as he told this story, every year he told it, he would change the description of what it was. But he said it was just, and he couldn't swallow it, and he spit it out. And then the percolator was sitting there, and the taste in his mouth was so bad that he picked up the percolator and put the spout in his mouth just to get rid of this taste. And my mother stood there and she said, "Uh-huh, I thought it was spoiled."
Yeah. Okay, so I speak collectively from every single person in this room and from the bottom of my heart. Ruth Reichl, you are the perfect peach. Right? Thank you.